Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming to this presentation about antimicrobial copper. Many of you will never have heard of this before, but hopefully this will be a quick romp through the principles. There's a bit of science, there's quite a bit of management stuff in there as well, but bear with me. My name's Mark Turr. I'm not a clinician, I'm not even a medic, I'm an engineer, so I know about materials, but I picked up a little bit on the way about microbiology on this program. So it's quite an interesting field, let us say. These are the subjects I'll be going through. I don't intend to read them out because I'm sure you can read. So we'll kick off and move on to the first one. What is antimicrobial copper? Well, essentially it's a whole family of materials based upon copper. We all know copper. We have our water coming down it in the form of tubes. We have our internet coming down it in the form of wires, our electricity. It's an interesting and very useful industrial material. But it has a new and interesting property. Now I say new, but in fact it's a property that's been there all the time. We just had forgotten about it. The ancient Egyptians knew about it, other cultures in history have known about it, but we've only been rediscovering this for the last 20 years or so. Antimicrobial copper is actually over 500 different alloys. These are mixtures of copper with other materials, and they are all regulated by the American Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, and allowed to make public health claims. And that regulation is now guided by my organisation, the Copper Alliance, which is a global group of technical centres, and we provide information and guidance for people that want to use antimicrobial copper in their facilities. Copper is now in more formal guidance and policy. Some of you will recognise these headings. But of interest, two of them, the first two, ECRI and CNESH here, are North American, what they call technology watchdogs. So they're always looking ahead at future technologies, what's coming next. And they're already mentioning, in fact, a couple of years ago, have been mentioning copper as something to look out for. This is new science, so we don't have all the proof we might like, but it shows promise for the future. In the UK, the EPIC 3 documentation mentions copper also as the most promising technology for environmental protection from contamination and infections. More work needs to be done, they say. And very recently, the Polish centre, which is sort of equivalent of the CQC combined with NICE, has given a better ranking for organisations that use environmental materials to reduce contamination. And it specifically talks about copper alloys in that documentation. So people are catching on. Why are we interested in touch surfaces? Because you'd think if this is so good, why don't we just plaster everything with copper? Well, that would be crazy and very, very expensive. I said this was new science. In fact, we rediscovered it about 30 years ago. A young doctor stumbled across the issue and observed that microbes on a brass door handle, which is a copper alloy, were far fewer than on stainless steel. This is published in 1983. And we took notice of this, of course, because we support technology in the copper industry generally. And we started to support research in this area. Now, most of you will recognise these documents. There is a lot of guidance, there's quite a lot of regulation, and if you were in at the previous presentation, that's becoming more and more, I would say, onerous. From an engineer's perspective, we've been doing something similar in industry for the last 30 years, so I have great sympathy. Get your plans in place. I've taken just one of these documents as the basis for the next few slides to explain how antimicrobial copper might have a role in the care sector. The WHO has had this program of washing hands for the last, 15 years or so. It's been very successful. It's helped to reduce infection in hospitals. This picture is taken from guidance document issued by the good old HPA, as it used to be. It's still very relevant. Those of you that know this will hopefully notice that there's something missing. Can anybody see? Okay. 5 moments of hand hygiene. We've only got 4. The 5th one is really important, and it's what's relevant to me, which is interactions with the environment. I think in the last 20 years, partly because of new developments in disinfection and partly because of the work that we've been doing on environmental issues in the care and health sector, a lot more focus has been going into the impact of the environment on infection rates. So this is what I want to talk to you about. In that same document, there's some very clear guidance on what constitutes a risk area. So we're talking about low-risk items that your clients might touch, in the case of a hospital, a patient might touch, that require regular cleaning. Intermediate risks, items that come into contact with the patient and require cleaning and disinfection. So what kind of things are we talking about when we're thinking about copper? And really it's this area. It's the medium risk area. Items that come into contact with intact skin, but not the mucous membrane. We're not talking about medical devices or anything like that. We're talking about close to patient, close to client touch surfaces. And things that require regular cleaning, followed by disinfection. Do you in the care home understand about decontamination? These are the steps that you need to consider when you're trying to reduce risk. As part of your duty of care, you're trying to improve the safety of your patients. So you should consider the risk quotient in any particular environmental surface. And cleaning is essential. It's absolutely the most important risk reduction process that you can employ. Work in hospitals has shown that 95% of microbes, germs, can be taken away just by cleaning, by proper cleaning practices. That leaves the 5%, and there's still some risk involved in those. But the closer you are to the patient, the more critical those surfaces are. So you should be disinfecting those as well. And when it comes to disinfection, you're not talking about complete sterilization. You're talking about reducing the number of microbes or germs on a surface. You're trying to reduce the risk constantly by reducing the number of microbes on an environmental surface. I said before that copper is only part of the program that you should be using now. You all clean your facilities. The 5 moments of hand hygiene are vitally important, and copper offers another opportunity to put another layer in place to complement those existing protocols that you have. So you must continue to wash your hands as regularly as possible. You must clean on a regular basis, but you can do something with copper which will help. It's another layer. I'll take you through a very quick review of the science because it's now huge. We have over 300 papers published in recognised journals on this subject. And if you take into account the papers that have been published on the influence of the environment on passing on infection, whether it's norovirus or C. difficile or any of those other microbes that we have concern about, there are over 1,000 papers. Luckily, we in the UK have been in the forefront of the research in this area, mainly because one of the key research centres is in Southampton University. Professor Bill Keevil has been fundamental in this research area. He heads up the Environmental Health Unit at Southampton University. He started life at Porton Down looking at Legionella when that became a public health issue, and has subsequently moved to the university and has spent about 20 years researching and publishing papers on copper and the effect of copper on different microbes. So you can read for yourself the number of microbes that copper's been tested against. 20 years ago there wasn't a suitable test. We've had to more or less develop one on the hoof. That's now the subject of a British standard that's going through committee at the moment, and I chair that committee. Pretty much every microbe that is of concern to human health has been tested. Copper is effective against all of them. I'll tell you more about that in a minute. Most interestingly, as we understand more and more over the years, we have found out that copper and copper alloys work best in the dry. So you don't need water. That's really important. You don't need moisture in the environment. And that reflects on the science behind all of this. This is what we call a kill curve. This line here represents how, in this case, VRE, vancomycin-resistant Enterococcus faecalis, dies on stainless steel. And really, that's pretty much a flat line. That's just it drying out over the course of, in this case, 10 minutes. This is the graph for copper. If you notice this number here, 10 to the 7, for those non-scientists among you, I'm sorry, that's about 10 million microbes on a surface. If your care home has got 10 million microbes on the surface, you're in big trouble. Typically, you'd be talking about 100, 200, maybe 500. So if you start in this sort of area, you can see the sort of timescales we're talking about for complete kill on copper. And this is typical of the kind of graphs that have been generated by many, many workers across the world over the last 20 years or so. There's lots and lots of science. I mentioned that before. That's why I would encourage you to take note of our website if you have interest in this, because the website is continuously updated. We give presentations like this maybe twice, 3 times a year. I certainly can't keep up with the science anymore. The workers in Germany, in Switzerland, in Russia. This is Bill Keevil's paper, published earlier this year, showing extremely rapid kill of MRSA on copper and copper alloy surfaces. And interestingly, there's been a lot of work in the last 5 years looking at the mechanism, not just what copper will destroy, but also how it's doing that. And fascinatingly, we find that the microbial DNA is actually destroyed as a final step in the destruction of the microbe. Not only is the microbe killed, it's killed absolutely dead, or, as they used to say in the old Domestos adverts, it kills things dead. This is a very simplistic view of how copper works. As soon as a microbe lands on a surface, a copper or a copper alloy surface, there's an interaction with the microbe itself. There are tiny amounts of moisture present in that, perhaps a biofilm or a splash or a cough or even a human touch. Our human touch is not as dry as we might like to think it is. So that starts to set up reactions, and the copper can interrupt existing metabolic processes that occur through the microbial cell wall. It can actually generate catalytically hydrogen peroxide on the surface as well. And that causes a lot of stress, what we call oxidative stress. Basically, it causes the microbes to burst. Then they start leaking, then there's a bit more liquid present, and thenceforth there is a rapid kill of the microbe. And incidentally, this works for viruses, gram-positive, gram-negative bacteria, as well as fungi and fungal spores. And as I mentioned, bacterial DNA is completely unwound at the final stages of the destruction process, if you like. Talk a little bit about the clinical trials. Most of these have been carried out in hospitals, not all, some in clinics. There are some new care home trials that are ongoing now. But it's been recognised and now it's generally accepted in the science fraternity that this is a phenomenon that is real. Copper will work against the majority of microbes. The only one that they found any resistance to is actually anthrax, which hopefully we don't have to worry about. Again, UK has been in the forefront of research in this area. The very first clinical trial was actually at Selly Oak University in Birmingham. 2 trials that ran over the course of about 2.5, 3 years, and they were looking at how copper in the hospital environment reduces contamination. So would the kind of work that Bill Keevil and others have done in the laboratory translate to the hospital environment? Now, the ward in Selly Oak was an open ward, it's a general medical ward. A lot of the clients, the patients in there were very similar to those that you would find in a care home environment. A lot of elderly, vulnerable people, extremely poorly, and therefore a very dynamic situation with lots of healthcare workers in and out all of the time. Most of the staff, most of the patients were mobile, so they were moving in and out, and lots of visitors as well. So they found a greater than 80% reduction in contamination compared to control surfaces. And control surfaces, I mean standard materials like plastic, light switches, aluminium door handles, things like that. This next study that I want to highlight, and I'll show you a few pictures, so don't get bored by the text up here. This next study was carried out in the USA in 3 different hospitals. It was funded by the Department of Defense. And this is just one of the 5 papers published from that trial. There's so much data generated from what was a 3.5-year trial that they've been able to publish a number of papers on it, different aspects. One thing that they found, partly by observation and partly by study, was the items that were most contaminated. And you can see these numbers and the numbers of microbes on the comparable copper and copper alloy surfaces right next to them. This line on this slide represents what has been suggested as a safety margin, a safety line over which contamination becomes an issue, becomes a risk issue for hospitals. And I would argue it's the same situation in healthcare, in the care sector, generally. But actually, we don't have a standard for how clean a surface is. It's very hard to measure these things unless you've got a microbiological lab close by. But you can see how well copper is done in all of these situations. In the majority of cases, the copper surfaces are reducing the bacteria levels right down. They also found that the more contaminated the environment, the more likely it was somebody would get an infection. That sounds sensible, sounds logical, but this is proof of that theory because it's actually quite difficult to prove. But the study was big enough to show that that is a genuine effect. The more contaminated the area, the more patients became infected. So there was a linkage proven there between contamination and infection. This is the latest paper published on a different trial. This is actually carried out in Chile. It was in a very, very busy pediatric center. In fact, so busy that they couldn't find a statistical significance to reduction in infection rates amongst the patients. And that's because their bed occupancy rates were running at about 120%. It was just going bonkers. And this trial ran again for about 3 years. So very recent work, they did show a tendency to reduction in infections, but not statistically significant. Now, copper may actually have a role in the fight against antimicrobial resistance amongst microbes. And this is now, again, part of the science that we're beginning to understand the influence of the environment. Because copper kills these germs absolutely and destroys their DNA, antimicrobial resistance cannot be transferred between microbes. And Bill Keevel's done work to show that this can actually transfer between microbes of different species. They don't have to be microbes of the same species even. So E. coli can transmit resistance genes to MRSA, for example. I believe that copper will have a role in this in the future. We're only scratching, if you pardon the pun, scratching the surface in our understanding of how the environment has an impact on infection rates and actually acts as a reservoir of these resistance genes unless they are regularly disinfected, or I would argue have a self-disinfecting surface there. Okay, practically what should be upgraded? What are the things that you should consider important to upgrade in your facility? Well, again, in America, which has led a lot of this environmental research, the American Centers for Disease Control, CDC, has published guidance on what they term terminal cleaning. So they're focused primarily on hospitals. When a patient, a client leaves a room, what are the surfaces that should be cleaned? So they've offered guidance in this area. All of these items with asterisks are on their list. Most of them are simple environmental touch surfaces and things that can be upgraded with copper and copper alloys, and actually were upgraded for that Selly Oak trial right back in 2008. So what we felt was the right thing to upgrade back then, the CDC now says, yes, you got it right. Well, eventually they caught up, which is great. Here's some pictures, examples exactly of that sort of environmental upgrade. Bed rails, chairs on arms, taps, and things that you will recognise from your own sort of environment. This is actually a sleep clinic in an NHS trust. This is a care home for both youngsters and the very elderly in France. This was an installation made about 4 or 5 years ago. On the continent, they tend to have a lot of these rails around hospitals. I don't think I've been into a hospital in France or Scandinavia where they're not putting these rails in. And it's not just for the elderly. We don't tend to do that. We have bump stops, I think, in our hospitals. I don't know what you have in care homes. This is a very recent installation in France. It's actually part of a 7-centre, 3-year trial to see what influence this sort of upgrade has in the care home sector. Champagne, of course, most of us know where Champagne is, northeastern France, but those care homes in that region have decided to embrace copper and find out what impact it has. I'm a bit biased, but I think all of this looks quite nice. It's a very homely feel. It's a sort of earthy colour. And we actually offer guidance to specifiers. We're on a stand just outside the door here at the front of the auditorium. If you want to include copper in new builds, we've published this document which offers guidance to how you can instruct your contractors to include it. But we offer lots and lots of other information as well. Cost-benefit analysis. You're not going to do it unless it actually gives you a benefit. Now, this is the hard benefit. This is the money benefit. But I would argue that there is a societal benefit as well. You could differentiate your care home by taking these steps. This cost-benefit analysis was done on the basis of the American trial, so it's focused predominantly on the hospital environment. And it was a model created by York University. York have one of the best and most highly respected health economics departments in the country. They advise NICE, and of course most of the work they do is on drug interventions. Is this drug worth giving? Does it give benefit? This was quite a departure for them. They looked at the data that came out of that American trial, and this is the kind of result that they gave. The American trial data was based on this sort of feedback, so a 25% reduction in infection rates, which is about half what they actually, 25% tendency for infections, and if they actually identified a 58% reduction in infection rates, which is almost too good to be true, which is why this paper has had a lot of hard press. But in fact, you have to report what you find. So what York did, they made a spreadsheet model that is downloadable from our website. You can put your own data in there and play around with it yourself. What I did before coming to this presentation was I put in some different rates. I said we've only got a 15% rate of infection, so quite low. We're only getting a 20% improvement in those infection rates. So what does the payback look like? And I got a payback period of less than 3 months. If you use this data, you get a payback period of less than 2 months. So it's really very, very significant. And those two figures are quite interesting as well, because in an ICU you actually save bed days, you clear beds. Not relevant perhaps in your own environment, but the cost per bed is extremely low as well. I think if you played around with this, you might be very surprised at the kind of results that you get. Okay, conclusions. We've entitled this talk Breaking the Chain of Infection, because we're only just beginning to realise that the environment plays a role in transmitting infections. Some guy 20, 30 years ago said the environment only gives a perhaps 10 or maybe 20%, has a 20% effect on how infections are transferred. Well, we think that might have been an underestimate. We're beginning to understand how microbes move around the environment now. Of course, a lot of this is by touch, but how do surfaces become contaminated in the first place? Often it's by splash, it's by inappropriate cleaning sometimes. So the environment's very important, and putting copper in that chain is a way of reducing the movement of, or reducing the reservoir and the movement of microbes around the environment. We've seen improved patient outcomes in the studies that have been done in the States and in Chile. And of course, I've emphasized this before, but this is a supplement. This is a very simple technology to apply, but it's a supplement to existing cleaning and hand hygiene protocols that you should already be doing. Payback in less than 1 year. Certainly in a hospital, that's the case. We don't have experience yet of care home environments. And it's extremely simple. You don't need any special training. Your normal maintenance people can usually install a light switch or a door handle, for example. What you can do now is come and visit us on the stand. We're right outside the door here. We'd like to know what you think about contamination in your healthcare environment. We know about hospitals. We've been on this campaign trail for 10 years or more. And we understand from the practitioner's perspective what they think is contaminated, which is pretty much what the CDC in the States and other researchers have identified as being the key things to look at when you're trying to reduce the risk of infection. You'll also get a free antimicrobial copper pen if you fill in this questionnaire. I actually understand that you'll enter a prize draw for a super Tom Dixon pen as well, if you're into that sort of blingy stuff. So come along and you will enter into a prize draw and get a really super duper pen. It's, I think, worth £50 or so. Do look at the website, because I can only give you a flavour of the science, the technology and the practical implications of this new technology in this short presentation. There's lots and lots to read. If you want some bedtime reading, that's the place to go. We've got lots and lots of documentation to help you. You can make up your own mind. Our job is to provide the science and to explain it to you in the best way that we can. We have documentation here for clinicians, for architects, for managers, for designers. We've tried to cover all those bases, and we're constantly reviewing these and upgrading them. So do come along and have a look at the website. We have a newsletter that goes out 4 times a year, so it's not really spam, I hope. And if you have any feedback and questions that might occur to you after the presentation, you just send them by email, either through the website or you can send them to info@copperalliance.org.uk. Thank you very much. Do come and visit us. We're right next door. And are there any questions? Or have I filled you with enthusiasm? Question here, please. I've seen you, don't worry.
Hello. Hello there. We've got 2 questions. I saw your hand and another hand went up.
Back there.
Fab. They'll have to be brief questions,
Of
just
course.
for the timings. Here you are, madam.
Sorry, Magda. Very quickly, thank you very much. That was very good. People cleaning, like our cleaning staff, with chemicals over these smudge marks, does it make any difference with the copper at all, alloy?
No, not at all. In fact, a major supplier of cleaning and disinfection products in Germany has recently published work on the effect on copper of their cleaning agents and the effect of their cleaning agents on copper in terms of efficacy. And they say they see no effect either way. Having said that, they've identified some evidence of synergy between one of their products and a copper alloy surface. So in fact, it may be enhancing the liquid disinfectant as far as its ability to kill certain microbes on those surfaces. I would emphasize that the clinical trials that have been undertaken in real hospitals, very busy environments, all the kind of cleaning agents that you would normally deal with, whether it's bleach or Oxivir or whatever the brand name you want to use, they have no effect on the long-term efficacy. The key thing is to clean, because the barrier of grease and grime and muck, that's the thing that might interrupt the efficacy of copper. So.
Aesthetics is an important thing in hospitals, residential homes and places like that. Some people may be tempted to try and coat the product to stop it oxidizing. Obviously, by doing that, you're going to kill the properties of the copper or the brass or whatever other alloy you're using. So it's important that you don't coat these objects. So what have you done to stop this natural oxidation to retain the aesthetic look of the product?
Essentially, there is nothing that can be done because these are active surfaces. But if you choose the alloy carefully, you will find that there is less obvious oxidation. Some technical alloys are actually very resistant to things like bleach and so on. One of the alloys being used widely in the States is stable for a long time into the future, 20, 30 years. It's very effective antimicrobially, but it's also very stable in terms of oxidation. But what you're talking about is an issue of perhaps fashion? I don't know. One of the very first installations in the UK was at a cystic fibrosis unit in Sheffield. It was installed 5, 6 years ago. What they decided to do was use pure copper, which oxidizes very quickly. And I went back and visited a couple of years ago thinking, oh, this is going to look awful. But in fact, because it was being cleaned regularly, because it was being used regularly, it looked stunning, looked beautiful, it was polished. So there's a little bit of an issue with the aesthetic if you don't like that look, but there's a lot of choice of alloys to go for, even things that look like stainless steel, which will not oxidize. And that efficacy of those materials continues even though they have an oxide layer on them. Thank you for the question.
The product doesn't have to be solid copper, solid brass. It can be plated, can't it?
You can electroplate pure
Yeah.
copper. The problem is
And you can even plate onto plastics as well, can't you?
you can do, indeed. The trouble is with those, and why we don't recommend them, for two reasons. One is, given the hard time that cleaners give to these materials and these products in the hospital or the care home environment, the copper plating isn't going to last probably more than 12 months because it's quite thin. But secondly, if you deliberately put a coating onto a surface, then you start to fall under regulation, which using a solid material actually gets you around, if you like, because it's an engineering product. But it's a great question, thank you. Okay, I think 2 questions is all I have, my quota, so that we can get back on schedule. Thank you very much for your attention.